Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Journal of the European Economic Association, or JEEA, Fundación BBVA lecture. This year, the European Economic Association and the Fundación BBVA bring us a very special Christmas present in the form of the lecture by Pol Antràs on the uncharted waters of international trade and the discussion by Hélène Rey. In 2004, the European Economic Association and the Fundación BBVA agreed to hold an annual lecture by world-class economists on a relevant topic. So these are the two keywords: world-class economists, relevant topic. The lecture is given twice a year at the meetings of the American Economic Association in January and at the headquarters of Fundación BBVA. The list of past speakers is truly amazing, starting with Jean Tirole in 2004, and I'm not going to bore you with the long list of names since then, but let me just mention that Daron Acemoglu gave the lecture in 2011, and Hélène Rey gave it in 2016, 8 years ago. I will be brief with the introduction of the speakers because they need no introduction. Pol Antràs studied at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona and did his PhD at MIT under the supervision of Daron Acemoglu and Jaume Ventura. His first and only job has been at Harvard University, where he was appointed full professor in 2007, only 4 years after his PhD. He has a long list of academic distinctions, which I will not cite, and an impressive set of publications, including 17 papers in the top 5 economics journals. Hélène Rey studied at ENSAE in Paris and did her PhD at the London School of Economics. She has held academic appointments at the London School of Economics and Princeton University, and since 2006 is professor of economics at London Business School at LBS. She has a huge number of academic distinctions, of which I will only mention for obvious reasons that next year she will be president of the European Economic Association. And she will forgive me, I cannot resist the temptation of mentioning that she's an officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. That sounds great, OBE. Okay, to whet your appetite for the lecture, let me just read from the abstract of the paper. And I quote from here. I outline new potential areas for theoretical research, including incorporating oligopolistic behavior into core models and fostering greater cross-disciplinary collaboration with other fields of economics and social sciences, such as behavioral economics or political science. I also discuss potential uncharted waters for empirical trade economies, while identifying potential new sources of data and ways in which official trade statistics could be improved. Finally, I explore how big data and artificial intelligence could reshape the design of international trade policy in coming years. What more can we ask for a lecture? Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Rafa. It's a great pleasure. It's a great honor for me to be here. You will allow me that in order to deliver the lecture, I will speak in English as a deference to Hélène Rey. But if you want to ask any questions in Spanish, please feel free, okay?
I'm going to switch to English. And I'm really, truly delighted to be here. The goal of the lecture is to present or discuss some of the key elements of the work that's going to be published in the Journal of the European Economic Association. What I'm going to do is that, but there's no way I can cover everything that's in the paper. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of some key themes in the paper. And then I saved a few minutes at the end to talk about more current events that are perhaps not best discussed in an academic paper, but that I think are of great interest. And I thought I would introduce them mostly because I want to hear what Hélène has to say about them, but also because it might make for a more fun discussion later after my talk. All right. So the starting point of the paper is this idea that if you look at international trade research in the last 25 years, I think this is a story of a resounding success. It's been a very successful research agenda. I think we've learned a lot from work in the field, and I think the timing is really splendid in the sense that we find ourselves today with a very high demand on our expertise to try to understand current events in the world economy. Having said this, the reason I'm writing an article on uncharted waters of international trade is because I personally, but I think many trade economists, and I see a few of you here in the audience, would agree that in trying to delineate scenarios, in trying to think about the consequences of some of the things we're seeing in the world economy, we sometimes feel like we don't have all the tools that we need. There are some areas where further analysis is needed. And therefore, but as I explain in the paper, there are many uncharted waters of international trade. There are many hidden treasures to uncover. So let me tell you what I want to talk about in the next 43 minutes. When I started thinking about these uncharted waters, the first thing I did at Harvard is the first thing I always do at Harvard, which is I go talk to Elhanan Helpman, my mentor. And he said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. He said, but you know that if you write that paper, you first are going to have to tell people what we actually did, right? So then I was sort of started having second thoughts. Like, I don't want to write an article about everything we've done in the last 25 years. There's a lot, many people have written about that. But I felt that, yes, it's probably productive to give a background of where we are and how we can build on what we have. So I did that in the paper, and I'll talk about it today. And maybe it's okay that I spend a bit of time on it today, because for some of you, you might be less interested in what academic researchers can do in the next few years, and you might be more interested in how do trade economists today think about what's happening in the world and how do we make predictions. But anyway, I'll talk about the chartered waters, and then I'll say a bit about areas where I think the models that we work with these days are limited, that they don't capture features that I think are important for understanding how trade impacts society. I'll talk about these theoretical matters, and then I'll talk a little bit about empirical matters. I myself am not, I do some empirical work, but I wasn't trained as an empiricist, so you should take everything I say in that part of the paper with a grain of salt, but I do want to talk about areas where I think more work would be needed, or data that would be particularly helpful for answering questions in my field. And then I have a section on uncharted policy waters. And I'll give you a gist about it today, but I'm probably not going to cover it in depth, because rather than talking about uncharted areas for research on economic policy or trade policy, I think it's going to be more fun if we think about policy in the current environment. How do we think about how the world economy might play out in the next few months? And I'll give you a bit of a gist of how I think about it. I think Hélène will focus her discussion on that, and then maybe in the Q&A you might be interested to kind of dig deeper. Okay, so that's the plan. If you like it, stay. If not, this is what I have. That's okay, so before I get started, 4 caveats very quickly. In writing something about uncharted waters, it's very easy to upset people. Oh, you're going to talk about this, but I have work on that. So obviously, some of the waters that I say are uncharted, there's work in those areas. But some of this work, in some cases, is a bit old. So I think there's a payoff in revisiting these areas with more modern vessels. Maybe we'll find treasures that we missed in the past. Other areas are really uncharted. There's very, very little work for that. You should always worry about why wasn't there work on that. Maybe it's hard. Maybe these are not really navigable waters. But I do think that there are areas where we haven't made progress that I think are navigable. Some of what I write in the paper is very much targeted to young academic researchers. I see a lot of young people here. I'm delighted to see that. Honestly, that's the target audience. But some of the aspects that I touch upon on the empirical side of the paper are basically meant ultimately for data keepers. Something about what kind of data would we need that we don't have access to now. This is not meant for researchers, but I think one of our responsibilities as researchers is campaigning for the data that we need. And we don't do that often enough, and I think we should. And then finally, this is uncharted waters for international trade. But the hope, and that I hope that's also the hope of the JEEA, is that the material might be of appeal to a broader audience, in particular researchers in areas close to ours, like the field of spatial economics or economic geography. I see two of the leading economic geographers here in the audience, so I'm glad that I put this up. Okay, onto the charted waters. In the paper, I identify 4 main charted waters in recent years. Obviously, the field of international trade is very broad, but I emphasize 4 key developments that I think have truly transformed the field. The firm-level approach to international trade, the study of multinational firms and global value chains, a quantitative trade theory, a quantitative revolution in the field, and empirical work that's become unshackled. It's not very obvious maybe from the slide. The last 2 are in gray, meaning that I expand on them quite a bit in the paper. I'm going to be very quick about them today because of time constraints. And I'll want to tell you a bit about the first 2 because I think it's important to understand where we're coming from. So firm-level perspective to trade, in one sentence, what is this new work emphasizing that unlike how we think about trade in neoclassical trade theories, going back to Ricardo, it is not countries that trade with each other. It's not England that is exporting cloth in exchange for wine. It is really firms that are mediating trade. And starting in the 1990s, a few empirical economists put forth a set of facts that basically challenged prevailing theories of international trade that either didn't think hard about firms or thought about firms in terms of, thought about trade from the lens of a representative firm. What we saw in the data, what folks saw in the data is that if you look at trade participation, exporting, importing, very few firms actually export, okay? You have sectors that are highly dynamic, large exports, but often only 20, 30, maybe 40% of firms export. Even when looking at exporters, those that actually export, there's a very, very skewed distribution of exporters. If you look at the top 1% of exporters, they account for close to 80% of US exports and imports, and that's true in many, many countries. So some very large exporters account for the bulk of exports. We've also, looking at measures of performance of firms that export or those that export more or less, we've observed that firms that export look very different than firms that do not export. And that's true even within sectors. You can look at narrowly defined sectors, and firms that export are larger, they're more productive, they're more capital and skill intensive. So they look somewhat different. And then a fourth salient fact is that when looking at exports of a country to another country, think about the exports of Spain to France or the exports of Spain to Zimbabwe. Obviously, Spain exports much more to France than to Zimbabwe, but to a large extent, it's because more Spanish exporters export to France than there are Spanish exporters exporting to Zimbabwe. That's what we call the extensive margin of trade in our field. The idea that some firms export, some don't, some firms export to some markets, but not to others. This selection into exporter is absolutely key in understanding exports, in that it accounts for about 2/3 of the variation. So if you want to understand why do we sell much more to some markets than others, you need to think about it from the point of view of firms. Why are some firms doing this and other firms are not doing that? The representative firm models are not good models to think about that. Now that's on the empirics. On the theoretical side, there's one paper that is obviously a seminal paper in this literature, which is a paper by Mark Mellitz, my colleague at Harvard, which essentially took off the shelf the canonical model of trade at that point in time, which was Krugman-like models that feature product differentiation, scale economies, monopolistic competition, and basically introduced intra-industry heterogeneity into the framework. The idea that industries are not populated by a bunch of firms that all look the same. There's some firms that are born more productive than others. There's firms that are born with products that are more appealing than the products that other firms offer in the market. And what's beautiful about this piece is that he showed that just introducing that heterogeneity, which in the model generates the series of facts that I just laid off before, which is selection into exporting. It explains better performance of exporters. It can explain the skewedness of the distribution of exports. And it also, more subtly, might explain why the extensive margin is so dominant in explaining trade flows. Now, that's on the export side. There's a lot of other work that has used similar tools to think about trade participation, but on the import side. You know, the fact that it's not just exporters that are larger than non-exporters, importers are larger than non-importers. Importers look more productive than non-importers. If you look at why does Spain import much more from France than it imports from Zimbabwe, is because there are many more Spanish manufacturing firms that source inputs from France than there are Spanish firms that source inputs from Zimbabwe. The same extensive margin is key on the import side. In thinking about input trade, economists, and I'm being a little bit unfair in just putting up my own papers here, but they've realized in thinking about imports, very often what firms import are intermediate inputs. And those intermediate inputs are often very highly customized to their needs. The automakers, they have parts of the car designed for themselves. So the markets for these inputs, they're very peculiar. They're not deep markets. And there's a lot of contractual aspects that you need to worry about, and I did worry about it for a while early in my career. So that's on the firm level trade. On going beyond importing, there's a body of work that has recognized that if you want to think about how firms interact in the world economy, thinking about them exporting or importing is a bit restrictive. In that starting in the 1980s, there was a process of fragmentation of production where complex production processes basically were fragmented across countries. It's not wine for cloth anymore. What we see when we look at customs forms and we interpret them as trade economies, what we actually see in those customs forms, it's essentially what we call slices of global value chains. Let me give you an example. There's the semiconductors, okay, obviously it's not exactly realistic, but if you understand how semiconductors are produced, there's a sequence of stages from like the raw, the raw silicon that you need to purify, there's wafer fabrication, assembly, there's a sequence of stages that are largely dictated by engineering constraints. And what we've observed is this multi-stage production process is now being done in a bunch of countries on Earth. And things come back and forth, sometimes in the same country. Every time this value chain crosses a border, there's a customs office that's going to record that transaction. So we often see at the border is just one step of a multi-stage global value chain. Now that begs the question of, can I think about these slices as being independently determined from the other ones? Can I see the export of the wafer to the assembly plant as being independent of the export of the assembled chip to the end users, which might be the electronics industry or the auto industry? Or might I worry that a given flow is affected by what's happening upstream or downstream from that chain? Obviously, you can't really think about these things independently. They're shaped by common costs. If a plane is produced with a bunch of parts, if we achieve lower costs, price is going to go down, demand's going to go up. We're going to need more wings. We're going to need more engines. All these transactions are going to be connected. Same with the demand for the product. So what this tells you is that when you're looking at trade statistics, interpreting a transaction as an export of one good to foreign consumers, that's it, that's how we interpret them in many trade models, that's restrictive. Because those transactions are often part of larger chains. And this is not about general equilibrium interdependencies. That's the bread and butter of trade economies. That's probably what defines our field, that we don't think about exports as independently of imports. We know that things equilibrate. Or we think about industry equilibria where what some firms do affects other firms. A lot of new trade theories about. This is about firm-level interdependencies, which is something that arises in these models of global value chains. Within that literature, there's been a lot of work on special type of arrangements that are mediated by multinational firms. These are firms that are not just part of global value chains, but they control and manage stages that are in more than one country, or they replicate production processes done in one country, they might replicate it in another country. And this has been important because it's sort of, if you think about, on the one hand, that global value chains have grown a lot, and the fact that trade is mediated by very large companies, it sort of gives you a hint that perhaps multinationals are quite large, have become quite dominant in world trade. And they are. Just to give you some numbers based on some very recent work of mine, this is focused on the US, for which we have particularly good data to kind of present this picture. But if you divide the US manufacturing sector, technically these are firms in the US that do some manufacturing. Some of these firms might do lots of stuff outside of manufacturing. But if they do some manufacturing, you have about 250,000, 250,000 firms, of which only 1.5% are multinationals. Okay, the vast majority of firms doing manufacturing in the US are not multinationals. Yet when you look at the multinational ones, they explain about 57% of the employment of those companies. They account for 76% of the sales of these companies. They account for about 87 or 85% of US imports and exports. So 1.5% firms, literally 3,750, yes, I did the math right, 3,750 firms account for close to between 80 and 90% of the exports and imports of firms that do some manufacturing. This is very significant. And these are across sectors. If you look at one sector or another sector, you're quickly going to end up with 2, 3, 4, 5 companies that account for the bulk of trade in those sectors. So that, to me, reinforces this idea that think about trade as something that follows from firm decisions that aggregate up to something that we see in sort of standard trade statistics, but think hard about how those micro-level flows were determined. Another aspect that I think is very interesting about this global value chains and multinational firms is that a large percentage of this of world trade is actually what we call intra-firm trade, in which it's not just multinationals on one side of the transaction, it's the same multinational firm on both the export side and the import side of a transaction. That's been estimated to be 1/3 of world trade. I don't know how much I buy that number, but for the US, it's about 48.6% of US imports. Okay, and if you look at particular countries, it's much higher. For Spain, it's somewhere there, it's about 30-some%. Which I've been fascinated by this fact since I was doing my PhD, because we tend to emphasize the beauty of the market and how it allocates resources to the most efficient uses, okay, the beauty of the market. Yet when I look at US imports, close to 50% of those transactions are bypassing the market mechanism. They're still maybe somewhat disciplined by the market mechanism, but these are not market transactions, which is a bit interesting. This literature, I use my time efficiently, but this literature has raised a bunch of technical difficulties that arise when thinking about this firm-level interdependencies, this idea that multinational firms, when setting up their production in many countries, think about automakers, they start worrying about, if I put a plant in this country, how much is it going to cannibalize sales in another market? There are reasons why these decisions might be complementary. If I have Ford opens a plant in Valencia, maybe it has a nice pool of suppliers that it could rely on those suppliers if they were to set up a plant in Portugal. So we share suppliers, maybe these decisions are interdependent in a complementary sense. So there's a lot of literature trying to think about these interdependencies. How do you model them? How are you able to estimate models in which firms make very complicated problems, but you can still solve those problems, so you have a model-based prediction of what firms do, and then you can discipline these models with data and try to find the parameters of the model that best explain firm behavior, on average. We never intend to explain what every businessman is going to do. Obviously, we don't have models that are so tailored to a given firm, but we can hope to match some averages so that when we have estimated these models, we can inform how the economy will react to changes in the environment, say trade costs, a tariff war here or a tariff war there. Okay, and I think this is, obviously I'm biased, but I think this has been a quite successful agenda in sort of, we've learned a lot from this type of models. We now have theories of superstar firms, as firms leverage the global economy to reduce cost through sourcing from many countries, or they expand by selling in various markets, either directly or through export platform. These theories can easily match the skewedness in the size distribution of firms. The fact that even if firms are not very different ex ante, through their choices, they might become very, very different in size. We've seen that import competition shocks, say the China shock in the US, can operate in much more subtle ways in this type of models. We've seen the tariffs. It matters a lot whether tariffs are set on final goods or inputs, because tariffs are not just protecting domestic suppliers or domestic producers. They might be putting sand in the wheels of global value chains and generate unintended consequences. We've seen in those models that if you restrict trade, you have tariff wars, you can get welfare effects on real income that are orders of magnitude larger than in models where you don't have this multi-stage production processes. Okay, so I could be going on, but this is about uncharted waters, and I'm almost halfway through, so obviously I'm going to have to skip it. Just I mentioned two other areas that are important. The quantitative trade theory, which very much builds on work by Eaton and Cordham. This is basically a booming area of research that has taken something that had been around for a while, this so-called applied or computable general equilibrium models, and has turned them into simple tools, much more powerful tools that allow researchers to combine data with simple estimation of some parameters, what we call the trade elasticity, to deliver quick back-of-the-envelope estimates of how a given trade shock or a given tariff will affect the world economy. Okay, so I have this formula there. Let's see if this works. You see this here in the corner. This is basically two parameters here. Lambda is the so-called domestic trade share. I may not get into the details of what it is, but it's something you can observe in the data. And there's another parameter, which is epsilon, something you can estimate. You have these two numbers, and you can compute certain counterfactuals, like what would happen if Spain went to autarky. Okay, that's incredible, right? That we can do this. There's some limitations to it, but that's had a lot of, it's generated a lot of work. That's not the only quantitative approach to trade. There's an approach, which is I've done most of my work on, which is more akin to empirical industrial organization, which is trying to estimate models that are not exactly fitting the data, and therefore they're not going to beat quantitative models in terms of model fit, but that perhaps provide more reliable counterfactuals. The last bit is on empirical work. So again, I'm just largely going to skip it. But I argue in the paper that there is a distinction between empirical work in trade in the 20th century and the 21st century. I'm being generalizing here perhaps, but a lot of trade theory in the 20th century was very much heavily disciplined by theory. Think about the Heckscherl-Vanneck literature or the gravity equation literature. Only when we had tight models did we go to the data. We see a bunch of young trade economists these days that are doing work that is not necessarily motivated by theory, but they're unveiling a lot of very interesting causal links between economic variables. Or they're relying on incredibly fascinating new sources of data. Like I edited a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that was using clay tablets from 4,000 years ago to shed light on where certain old cities in Anatolia, which archaeologists debate about where they are, they use trade theory and very old data to kind of guide where those cities might be. So there's a bunch of work that is not necessarily motivated by theory, but is using empirical work very effectively. Much more I could talk about charted waters, but this is about uncharted waters, and there's theoretical ones and empirical ones. I realized I was going to be tight on time, so on the theory side, I'm just going to zoom in on two of them, two of the ones that I outline in the paper. One related to oligopoly and another one related to national security. If you came to hear me talk about behavioral economics, I'm sorry, but I will not. I'm not going to talk about redistributive policies, the data economy, trading culture. These are things that I comment on in the paper. So what do I mean by oligopoly, right? So it's the idea that I think is almost self-evident from what I mentioned already today here, which is if you look at the distribution of market sales of exporters, and I'm telling you that 1%, the top 1% accounts for 80% of exports, and that if you look at a more disaggregated level, the skewness is even higher, that basically implies that at the sectoral level, the largest exporters are going to have huge market shares. And indeed, there's a bunch of papers that have documented that. It's also clear if you think about certain industries. You think about the aircraft industry, yes, there's some small companies that produce smaller planes, et cetera, but it's largely a duopoly. If you think about semiconductors, lots of people writing about them these days, and certain segments, I showed you that chip thing, there's some parts of production that are super concentrated. I was in the Netherlands earlier this year. There's a firm in the Netherlands that is the unique producer of some very precise machines, the machines that you need for very precise type of chips. There's the only company that does this in the world. So long story short, this world of monopolistic competition doesn't seem to fit with the data. Not only that, but that's true for multinational activity as well, where think about Coke versus Pepsi. That's essentially a duopoly in a market if you define it as the type of drinks that they produce. The other aspect that I want to emphasize is that our models current workhorse models typically assume free entry, which basically means that even though firms feature scale economies, so they're going to obtain some operating profits when selling, we tend to think about those operating profits as largely covering the development costs of producing new products. Okay, so we innovate, and then we're going to have to recoup it in terms of profits. But there's a lot of work out there indicating that perhaps those profits are more than just compensating for some fixed cost, that there are really larger and larger profit margins. I think Jan Eckhout was giving this lecture at some point, and I'm pretty sure he was talking about this. That's what he's been talking about. So perhaps we need to move away from models with monopolistic competition and free entry and think about models with oligopolistic competition and restricted entry. Now you might say, maybe some of you, I don't see anybody with a light, but you might say, is this an uncharted water? What is this guy talking about? We've been thinking about oligopolies since the 1980s. At the same time that Paul Krugman was writing the benchmark models with monopolistic competition and free entry, Krugman 79, Krugman 1980, well, there was Brander, and then Brander-Krugman 83, and Brander-Spencer. There's a bunch of papers pushing that oligopoly was important. But, and it's also true that more recently, there's been more and more papers thinking about markets in which firms are large enough to, through their pricing, affect the pricing of their competitors. Okay, so there's some active literature, especially thinking about pass-through of exchange rates, pass-through of other shocks that emphasizes this oligopoly dimension. But remember what I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is if you want to understand aggregate trade flows, even if you only care about macro trade flows, you really want to understand how firms decide to sell to some markets and not to others. This extensive margin of trade. And there is very little work, if not, close to no work, thinking hard about how in this oligopolistic environment where firms are competing with each other and taking actions that are strategically trying to affect the behavior of their competitors, how that's shaping up this extensive margin of trade. So let me sort of tell you a bit more specifically what I have in mind. So in models in which folks are thinking about large firms and how the large firms might make pricing decisions that try to affect market shares, they typically those models take the set of firms operating in a market as being exogenously given. Obviously, they understand that in order to kind of close these models, you need to think about how those entry decisions happen. But they basically assume that the large guys move first, and then the next biggest guys move next, and so on and so forth. So these models have very nice features where the large firms are going to be selling to more markets, they're going to obtain higher revenue, and so on. But we know that in those models, that's just one of many equilibria. There's no reason why you are always, as an importing country, and you have foreign firms selling in your market, it's not necessarily the case that you're always going to be having the most efficient exporters from the other country sell in your market. In some cases, you might be stuck with the relatively less efficient exporters that because they're already exporting in your market, it preempts the entry of other ones. Or you might have situations where anticipating a trade opening, a local firm that is perhaps less efficient than a foreign firm might take actions that preempt the entry of foreign exporters. So this type of strategic effects that are quite natural, I think, and for which there's some evidence, I think they're completely missing in our models, and they could matter a lot for welfare. That's on the export side. On the import side, we also tend to think, I mean, if you talk to businessmen, very often they're going to tell you something like, well, you know, I was operating in Spain and I was quite comfortable, but my competitors, they opened this plant in Romania, they cut costs, and I had to do something because they were taking all the market share away from me. So I had to go and find someone in Romania or Bulgaria or something like that. So there's a lot of these importing decisions that seem to be reactions to what other firms in the industry are doing. Which again has a flavor of the strategic effects at the extensive margin. Same with multinational activities. Many years ago, even before I was born, Knickerbocker was writing about the so-called oligopolistic reaction by which multinational firms took actions that often led to the reaction of their competitors following suit and taking very similar actions. This, again, I told you, it's natural. It's so natural, some of these ideas, that I find myself teaching this to undergrads every year, precisely these ideas. We teach the effects of trade. Sometimes we use oligopoly models. This case is a homogeneous Bertrand model, where we tell them initially you have a monopolist that is operating in the market. It's basically charging, it's operating at a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I don't know how good this is. And then it's pricing and obtaining a margin of P minus C. And then their government says, hey, we're going to open up to trade. So now you're going to face competition from a foreign producer. Suppose the foreign producer has the same marginal cost or similar, but it faces a trade cost. Then naturally, the domestic producer is going to raise its price up to the point at which it deters entry from the foreign producer. Okay? And that's going to generate an effect by which prices are going to fall from P to CF plus T. And we know that in this environment, this is going to increase welfare because the discipline of foreign competition has reduced markups and has partly done away with the monopoly distortions. This is an example where we have an increase in real income, even though there's been absolutely no change in trade. There's no trade happening here. The domestic trade share in this quantitative models where it tells you I can compute the welfare effects by seeing how much the domestic share changes. This is not changing, yet welfare is going up. This example tells you the formulas that we're applying, they cannot be universally right. There's an example where clearly the formula is not doing, it's not working. So I think we need to think a lot about this strategic effects, entry, preemptive entry, and how do these things, how much is there of that in the data, and how much is it shaping the income effects of trade? National security. So obviously, I don't think it's very hard to motivate this these days. I mean, every day you open the news and there's another example you can put in the slides. So I didn't put any, but there's many tensions going on. And they're impacting trade. And Hélène is going to show you more about this. But for a long time, even the US-China trade war was not impacting US-China trade much. But now we had a fall in US imports from China of 20% last year. So we're back to 2013 levels. It's also clear, and in part it's because of the tariffs, but then, you know, some of those tariffs, as you know, were motivated, at least in Trump's words, based on national security concerns. It's also clear that obviously we understand that, and we should have always been caring about this, because we understand that there's some goods that by their nature we cannot support free trade. We would never want our country to export nuclear warheads to our enemies. That's obviously a bad idea. At the same time, there's lots of goods like semiconductors that are a bit more peculiar, right? Because we might be willing to export semiconductors to China so that they put them in their phones, and then we can import those. Think about an iPhone, which is manufactured in China. We can then import it, and then we have better functioning phones. That's a good idea. But what if that semiconductors, maybe they find their way not to the intended buyer, but they may end up being used by the military in China, which is not an enemy, but it's a country that is less well aligned with the US. So in the world, there's a lot of what we call dual goods, dual-use goods, which may be used for consumption, but they might be used for military purposes. And I think the regulation of those goods is complex. We've seen that more and more governments, the EU is considering more and more goods that traditionally were not deemed to be problematic. They're more and more considered dual goods. So because I don't think these geopolitical tensions will disappear anytime soon, I think it's important to deepen our understanding. In the paper, I elaborate a bit on that, but one dimension that I think is particularly interesting to economists is to try to think about the implications of national security concerns for social welfare. When we teach trade policy, we're very good at talking about the benevolent social planner, the optimal tariff argument. We have a good handle on political economy, how political economy and lobbying affects trade policy, how political economy might affect trade policy in other environments. But when it comes to national security, I don't think we have a good handle. And I don't think that the models of political economy that we work with in trade are models that could explain what Putin is doing in Ukraine, or could provide a rationale for friendshoring policies or for Trump policies. These are not motivated by political economy. They're motivated by other reasons. So how do we think about national security concerns? I'm going to skip the next slide, but one aspect that I find particularly fascinating is this idea that it seems like for the longest time, we put a weight of 0 on national security. We don't worry about it at all. And then when a crisis hit, it became paramount. If you talk to policymakers in the US now, you tell them, you can do friendshoring, you can do this and that, but that's going to cost you. There's going to be inflation. We're going to lose income. They would say, we don't care. We understand this, but national security is paramount. So in times of crisis, it's like all we care about. In times of peace, we don't care about it. I find that very hard to understand, because you can't really prepare so quickly. It's sort of a bit strange to me what's in the mind of policymakers. And so that and other questions that I'm going to leave up here, I think are open questions in the field. How to think about national security, how to think about alliances, how they shape trade policy, how do trade flows shape alliances? These are questions that I think trade economists could contribute to, but they haven't. Uncharted waters, empirical uncharted waters, policy uncharted waters. On the empirical front, lots in the paper. I'm just going to put up a series of questions that I don't think we have answers to. Just to give you a sense of, yes, there's been a lot of incredible empirical work in the field, but if you want to understand how granular are GVCs, we have some estimates, but they're pretty noisy. If you care about the environment, what's the carbon footprint of global value chains? We don't really know. If you want to understand how concerning certain trade flows might be for national security, we don't have good data for this. So a lot of what I do in the article is try to lay out how can we improve statistics, the statistics that are made available to either researchers or to policymakers, to make them better able to answer these questions. And one aspect that I think is particularly key is the mapping of global value chains. It's super hard to move from like a silly figure that I had with the semiconductors that is based on some simple research to something much more trustworthy. Can we identify the key players? Can we identify the flows? Well, it's hard, but it's doable. We have the data. We have most of the data because customs record these transactions. Many countries have VAT taxes. value-added taxes. That means that even the domestic transactions, we have records. So it's really an issue of cross-border agreements so that we find ways to share the data in secure ways, making available for research purposes, for whatever purposes might be, and mapping these global value chains. For that, we might need international organizations to do this. And I'm not hopeful that's going to happen anytime soon, given everything else that's happening. But that's not going to stop me from saying this, I think, would be a very, very worthwhile exercise. In the meantime, we might have substitutes. There's private companies that, because data is valuable these days, they buy data, they recycle, they put it together, and then they resell it. And there's some firms that are in this business, and we might be able to rely on those. But it's always going to be a substitute for the better data, which is out there, but we need to put together. Let me skip this. In the paper, I provide some guidance on policy matters that are particularly relevant for academics, but I'm just going to turn to briefly a few points about deglobalization to get Hélène's reaction, and then to kind of put some things on the table for the Q&A later. So we have a body of work that has informed at least my views on how to think about globalization. There's a lot of debate about deglobalization, the sense that we might be entering a new phase where the world economy was globalizing a lot in the last few years, growing a lot, trade growing much more than GDP, but we might have taken a turn. Perhaps we have, and certainly the ratio of world trade to GDP is not growing the way it was growing. It's pretty stagnant. But that I don't see much direct evidence of deglobalization now. It is true, however, and it's at the same time, we faced the COVID crisis, which was a very significant crisis in many ways, but it affected world trade, but we rebounded pretty solidly from that. So that showed that the world economy showed a remarkable amount of resilience to that big shock. But now we're seeing much more action, and Hélène will talk much more about that. We are seeing that geopolitical factors are really impacting the geography of world trade. Maybe not deglobalization, but we're seeing certain flows differently. The US-China trade war, which for the longest time in this type of talks, I kept saying, look, we've had all these tariffs, but we're not seeing much action. And I had the sense that, yes, these are non-trivial tariffs, but a lot of firms laid out these value chains. They incurred large sunk costs in the process, and firms were on a wait-and-see strategy, trying to wait to see whether the waters were going to calm down or not. We reached a point where it's clear that this tariffs will stay there for a while, and now we're seeing flows of trade that were coming directly from China to the US. We now see more trade between China and Mexico, US, China, Vietnam, Vietnam, US. We're seeing much more of this rerouting where flows are taking this sort of longer ways to move from China to the US, which is a very interesting phenomena we've been seeing. We see a lot of calls for friendshoring in the US. The idea that we should have tariffs vis-a-vis other countries, but maybe especially for countries that are not geopolitically aligned. I think Hélène will talk a little bit about that. I think that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous from the point of view of the US especially, because when making those statements, the US seems to have a view of, let's isolate China. If they don't behave, we're going to have decoupling, and they're not going to be able to deal with my allies. But if you look at a map of the world and the set of countries for which various countries are the largest trading partner, you have a European bloc, which for many countries, Germany is the largest trading partner. You have a US bloc, and then you have a Chinese bloc. The US bloc, there's a lot of countries, but most of them are in the Caribbean, and frankly, we don't think are too important for the world economy. And lots of countries that are in the Chinese bloc, they're actually very important. Yeah, maybe many African countries, you don't see it because it's very small, but you have Korea, you have Japan, you have Australia, you have Brazil, you have Chile. Do we really think these countries will fall in line with the US and isolate China when they rely on China so much for buying their goods? Think about Chile. 50% of their exports is copper. Can they give up purchases from China? I'm not so sure. So the concept of alliances is a very, very fluid one, and I worry that if you push too much for friendshoring, you might end up on your own. There's a lot of demand for diversification, increased resilience. that, maybe there's an argument for that. Maybe there's a, but you know, we need to make compelling arguments for this. You can't just say, look, and I have work showing this, firms in the US were not diversified. They were buying this input from only one supplier. Why would they do that? Why did they do that? Because that was the efficient thing to do. There's scale economies. You don't want to have 3 producers of something that is very special to your needs that requires lots of investments. We might decide that we don't want that as a society, but if we move to more diversification, that's going to lead to worse exploitation of scale economies. It's going to lead to higher costs. It's going to lead to higher prices. We might be fine with that, but we need to be upfront about it, that this diversification is going to necessarily come with higher inflationary pressures. I'm done. Just I have in the conclusion this quote about the beauty of a model and how someone had written a system of equations that captures every single detail and provides an effectively complete theory of international trade. This is not Mark Mellitz writing this. This is Pareto 128 years ago. Okay, so that it's a give of warning of maybe the field has done a lot. We have lots of models that look very successful. When we write it in journals, we make it look like it's an amazing model. It explains everything. But history tells us that our models are obviously there for a period of time, and then they get superseded by better models. And the goal of the paper is to try to have people be encouraged to kind of contribute to this and find more hidden treasures. Thank you.
Good evening. So first of all, let me start by thanking very much on behalf of the European Economic Association, the BBVA Foundation, for this amazing lecture here and for supporting it. It's an incredible pleasure for me to discuss this great paper by Pol. I expected something, you know, very insightful, clear, pedagogical, and all of that was. And you covered such an amazing amount of ground. That's pretty impressive. So obviously, you should all read the paper forthcoming in the Journal of the European Economic Association. But I have to discuss now. It's my job. And obviously, I cannot pick up on all the points that are on the talk, in the talk, or in the paper. There's just too much. However, I'm going to be concentrating on a few of the, I guess, maybe the most topical elements that Pol has touched upon. And in a way, when I was thinking about this discussion, I thought, you know, he has this wonderful picture here in the front of his slides, which I took again, these uncharted waters of international trade. But if we look at the current situation in the world economy, we might be much more in a situation like this one. We are really, really riding probably stormy waters at this point in time. And so why is that? Well, I think there's a number of very, very important developments that we are seeing and that Pol started to discuss. So first of all, we are probably in a time of geopolitical fragmentation. And yes, this matters for many, many different points of view, but in terms of trade, obviously, we have a tariff war. We had effect on supply chains also because of the pandemics, because of you know, the war in Ukraine as well. So this has caused a lot of disruption. So there's a lot of things to think about the remodeling of the world economy because of geopolitical issues these days. In that world, more fragmented world, so firms are very important, and they are very important in trade, as Pol showed us. Some firms account for most of the trade, right? And so how does that play out when the world is fragmenting? And so I would like to ask Pol a little bit more about that. And then something that Pol started to discuss a bit in his paper, but I think is going to become more and more prominent, is also the relation between trade and climate change, the carbon footprint. And also in Europe, we have discussed carbon border adjustment mechanism in order to try to, in a way, introduce carbon pricing in a way that doesn't affect the level playing field of trade around the world. So I would like also to ask Paul a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's start with this fragmentation. So the world economy has been changing, and recently there has been some dramatic things happening, but just to remind you, it's the network of trade is in constant evolution. So here, if we go back to 2000, this is a network of international manufacture, merchandise trade export, okay? And you can see that the size of the bubbles are proportional to the size of exports and imports of countries, and then the arrows indicate the exports of one country vis-à-vis another country. And you see that if we go back in 2000, so we have some pretty big bubbles, which is very much in the center. Here is the United States, a lot of link in merchandise trade, and you have the gravity forces that apply here. You have a lot of exports vis-à-vis Canada, you have also Mexico, but there's also obviously Europe, EMU here, that maybe you can see if I show you here. That's EMU, that's Europe, essentially, that's the euro area. So it's another extremely important area in terms of international trade. And then you have the UK, etc. Okay, so that's what the world looks like in the 2000. Now, however, if we fast forward to 2019, okay, so that's a relatively recent period, you see that the world has changed a lot already. China has entered the WTO at the beginning of the 2000. And now we have moved from a world in which China was somewhere in the periphery to pretty much a multipolar world, a tripolar world, where we have China, US, and Europe as some of the big nodes in our world economy in terms of international trade. So big evolution, and you can also see the density of the links, right? We are very interconnected with some clear multipolarity. Now, because I usually do also international finance, I'm not going to show you, but if I showed you same type of networks, but for international financial flows as opposed to international trade flows, it would actually look very different. There, China would not have emerged nearly in the same way. The US would still be very much at the center, and Europe would be a distant second in terms of international finance. So whether you look at the world through the prism of trade, or if you look at it through the prism of financial flows, capital flows, you're going to get pretty, actually, different pictures. But let's take a look at world trade and what has been happening in terms of fragmentation. Well, I think that through history, we have already seen that geopolitics matters for trade flows. So here, we can see, so the historical world trade since the end of the 19th century until a relatively recent period, you see global trade in blue, and you see goods trade between blocks, right, in red. And you see a divergence during the Cold War area. So during the Cold War, we could already see that geopolitics mattered quite a bit for the geography of trade flows. Okay, so there was a divergence, and there was not much trade across blocks. Essentially, trade between blocks was relatively small. The red block kind of remained stuck at the bottom for a while, and then it kind of picked up, though not reaching the blue line, obviously, but it kind of picked up. And then we had a period of decrease in the speed of globalization that Paul also had on his graph, the slowbalization period towards the end. So this is pretty much the kind of picture that we had until relatively recently. However, because of the trade war, okay, between the US and China, because also of the Russian aggression to Ukraine, I think we have entered into an area in which things are speeding up a little bit in terms of fragmentation and geopolitical risks. So here, what you have is the number of harmful restrictions on trade and investments that have been put up in the recent years. And you see that on goods, there's quite a bit. Investments, there's some, and also we start to see some on services. So definitely a kind of structural break around 2020, right, in terms of the number of restrictions that we see. And we can pick that up in a number of measures. If you look at geopolitical risk indices, for example, that has been constructed by looking at many media, text, etc., and picking up the number of terms mentioning geopolitical risk in various ways, etc., you can see that this has picked up, and so have any measure of fragmentation that can be constructed in similar ways. There are some researchers who specialize on these computational linguistics type of measure. It's a very active area of research now that produces new data that we can analyze. So it's the analysis of textual analysis using computers. And so it's an interesting way of measuring fragmentation. So both these measures kind of peak, as you can see, in the recent period. And we can do some finer analysis, and so here it's mainly coming from analysis at the International Monetary Fund, where they've been looking at measuring the divide across blocks and how it has changed post-trade war, essentially. And you can see on the left, you can see the change in trade growth post-war, and you can see that between blocks, again, it has decreased much more between blocks than within blocks. The same thing if we look at foreign direct investment, which is in the middle, foreign direct investment. Also, you can see more decrease between blocks than within blocks. And in general, if we look at this time cross-border financial flows, portfolio flows, banking flows here, and bilateral swap line, these are payment facilities that the central banks put up with each other to provide the liquidity. In fact, those financial links have become less important when geopolitical distance has increased. Okay? When geopolitical distance increases, you have less of these financial links. So this set of evidence, I think, tells us that recently geopolitical risk is increasing and is having some effect on when we can measure on fragmentation in the world economy, in trade, not only in trade, but especially in trade. Other measures of fragmentation constructed from trade data, this one also from data both on realized trade data that we observe, but also on the type of restrictions that we put, also on foreign direct investment, etc. When this blue line goes up, it means more fragmentation. And this blue line, which has been done by Jesus Villaverde here with a researcher at Penn, tells the same story. You see the last part of the graph, it goes up. More fragmentation, definitely, happening with the US-China trade tensions, but also the COVID period and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think it is happening. It is happening, Paul, more than indeed maybe it was before when we were just seeing this kind of plateauing of global trade. Now, so that's a lot of it is about trade flows like final goods trade, merchandise trade, etc. But maybe more critical, and this is something that Paul alluded to, we have to think about this global value chain and these production networks, okay, which are spanning different continents in the world economy. And there, in particular, there are inputs which are more critical than others. So you mentioned this very specialized type of chips in the Netherlands. We also know about the Taiwanese production, right? So these certainly interact very much with national security. They interact very much with geopolitical power. And they can be, as we say now, weaponized, or they could be weaponized, even more than they have been so far. And what is interesting, maybe, is that I took that from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's an EBRD. It's a report looking at export restrictions put on critical raw materials. And I don't know if you can read, but you have here a lot of germanium, barium, gallium, etc. A lot of these lithium a lot of these critical inputs, which are very important for the green transition in particular, if we are thinking about batteries and we are thinking about electric vehicles, etc. And if we look over time, so the restrictions on these critical inputs and the exports of these critical inputs has been going up. Now, I've been looking a little bit at this data also in terms of who is importing, who is exporting, and the type of network. And one can see that very much there's a Chinese entry there. China is very much occupying the center of the network for a number of these raw earth critical input for battery construction in particular. So it's very, very striking. Okay? It has just changed the shapes of the networks. And China is also processing a lot of these rare earth, etc. So I think there's something about, national defense, or something about resilience, something about strategic sovereignty considerations. All right. So now, in these global value chains, and what is the role of firms? So I think Pol has really shown us something very important here, which is that there is a tremendous amount of skewness and concentration. Very few firms account for the bulk of export and imports. He showed us, this is his graph, his data. On US data, I suspect internationally it's probably relatively similar, maybe harder to establish. But there is a lot of concentration. So there are some big firms which account for most of these linkages here. Now, this is very important for a number of reasons, I suppose. So one reason, obviously, is market structure. And a lot of the work of Pol, extremely important and insightful, is about this and oligopoly. And he showed us how, that kind of pretty much changes the way we should look at things with his simple example, which I thought was really illuminating. Even if you don't see trade, doesn't mean that things are not changing. But that also matters if we think about stuff that maybe macroeconomists would think more about, which is, for example, recently, we have had an inflation surge. Inflation has gone up, not only in Spain, everywhere in the advanced economies and also in emerging markets. We have seen inflation going to the double digits in many places for the first time since a very long time. Okay? And I think now most people would agree that a big part of this inflation surge was coming from energy prices, but also disruption to supply chain, and in particular when you measure them with transportation cost, time to ship, etc. The disruption to the global supply chains have changed relative prices quite, sizably, and these change in relative prices under some conditions in monetary policy translate into inflation, which is what we have seen. Now, this has had a lot of impact, obviously, on the cost of living for many people. It has had massive political economy impact. Does look like people are very upset with inflation, which I can understand, and so when they vote, that reflects pretty much their distaste of inflation. So this is a big deal. And if we can think about ways in which we can make the global value chain a bit more, resilient, so not having these price spikes, which then kind of transmit into the economy, I think it is a very important goal and very important research agenda to think about. Now, large firms play a big role there, right? So large firms, on the one hand, they are very much exposed to the global economy because they are large and they operate in many different continents. So if you were operating with, with Russia, with etc., you are very much affected. On the other hand, they might also be more diversified. Okay? And because they are also very large, they may have better access to certain critical input, to certain suppliers, etc. So that may also matter for the relative price movement and the resiliency of the entire supply chain. So I was wondering if this is something that, in international trade, people are kind of thinking about and looking at. Okay, and finally, so I think we now, have to think very hard about climate change in all the the economic applications that we think about, whether it is macro, whether it is international trade here. And there is obviously a burning issue currently about electric vehicles exports of China, which, so the US is putting some high tariffs, so there's an issue about trade diversion of these electric vehicles towards Europe and what Europe should be doing. And this is not a trivial problem, right? Because on the one hand, you have the effect on European car industry and the effect on jobs. And on the other hand, you have also the commitments of Europe towards net zero by 2050. And it's going to be much harder to lower the cost of that commitment if we don't have Chinese electrical vehicles, let alone Chinese solar panels, which are very, very cheap, right? Which are the cheapest, etc. So how do trade economists kind of think about these various type of issues? It would be very interesting to hear your views on that. And finally, because Europe is innovating also in terms of having a carbon price, we have an emission trading system, we have a carbon price that applies for a number of industries in Europe, and therefore we do not want to allow to have imports from areas of the world in which the carbon price is much lower than ours, because that's not a level playing field. When you do cement, if you have to pay a certain carbon price, because you're a cement producer, you don't want to allow imports of cement from another country in which the price of carbon is very low, right? That's not a good, that's dumping essentially. That's not a good level playing field. So in order to deal with these issues, Europe is designing carbon border adjustment mechanisms which are supposed to make up for the difference in carbon price across different areas in the world. So if you don't have a carbon price, I'm going to put a carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, which is going to increase the price of imports in order to match my carbon price. Okay? That's the idea. Okay? So it's definitely right down the alley of trade economists, and this is why it would be so interesting to hear also Paul about this CBAM and the W compatibility of the CBAM, and how also we can use this in a world where we have emerging markets and poor economies. So to conclude, I could have picked up on a lot more interesting things, but I tried to limit my discussion to the fragmentation and geopolitical risks, also to the role of big firms and their role in relative price changes, etc., resiliency, and also the debate between trade and climate, and how we can design CBAMs which are going to work for Europe. So I think there are lots of ideas to play with in Paul's paper and in his talk, and so I will just invite him to do so.
Thank you, Paul and Hélène, for these beautiful and thought-provoking presentations. Before opening the floor for discussion, I want to give Paul the opportunity to respond to Hélène's discussion. So,
more than respond, I wanted to thank you. That was a fantastic discussion, and you put a lot of things on the table. I know we're mindful a bit of time, so I'm obviously not going to weigh on all the things that you raised. But there's a couple of them that I thought particularly interesting that I could try to connect either to what I said or to things that I said in the paper that I didn't have the time to talk about. The first one is, this idea that larger firms might be able to better cope with this geopolitical environment. You asked, is work on that? I haven't seen a lot on that. I think it's very important. Our current workhorse models would tell you, I think, the opposite, right? So you cannot make the claim that, like I did, that the process of globalization has allowed firms that were somewhat larger to better leverage this forces to grow disproportionately faster, and not make the obvious then consequence that if you start raising tariffs, that's going to lead to a disproportional dismantling of the large companies, right? So a compression in the size distribution of firms. But maybe this symmetry, which is a natural one in the type of models we write, is not the right way to think about it, because some of these initial costs are sunk costs. Maybe because the firms have not just expanded, but they have at their disposable resources that allow them to react more quickly to shocks. This is super interesting, but our models would say the opposite. And then on carbon border adjustment, definitely, I mean, I think I should have probably written more about this in the paper. It's just not an area that I work on, but maybe I should sort of start working more on that. Obviously, the mapping of global value chains would one of the side effects it would have is better enforcement of this carbon border adjustments. But ultimately, the issue of climate change is an issue that requires international coordination at a big scale. You mentioned WTO compatibility. Frankly, I could only smile in that there's nothing that is compatible with the WTO that's going on in the world right now. And I think countries have stopped worrying about that. But, you know, how are we going to move out of this current environment where America first, Europe first, something first, and move to a more global mind frame that might put us in a better position to actually deal with this problem, which is a global one? Mm-hmm. And I don't have any ideas about this, but it's obviously something that we need to find our ways to deal with.
Okay.
And you know, but thanks. That's much. We can talk more about it later. But there's a lot of cool stuff in what you said. I think our field has become increasingly quantitative, or sort of now that we have tools to turn simple models into more complex ones by adding these elements that allow you to map closer to data, I think it is sort of limiting, you know, it's sort of limiting the ability to kind of get crisp insights from these models. And often when reading papers, I have that feeling. I think there is a reason for that. I think that you're very well aware of, which is it's a bit of introspection, but I think that's why I sort of changed, in some sense, the type of papers that I was writing, which is that it's become increasingly hard to publish certain types of papers in journals. And I mean, I'm at a stage where I'm going back to actually, if you look at some of my recent work, I've gone back and I'm trying to do more sort of simpler modeling, but we cannot blame young people for playing the game. Now we could think about why is this the game we're playing, and how do we kind of go back to the game, or sort of make sure that there's different types of games played in research. And I don't have a good sort of a good way to kind of get there, but at some level it's not like it's normal that we're seeing what we're seeing. People are responding to incentives. I think I know better than trying to predict where the stock market is going to go. So but let me answer this in a way that I open the door for Hélène to give us a better answer, which is absolutely I've ignored the financial aspects, not because I don't think they're important. I think I would love to see the figure that I showed, the figure that you showed on the network in terms of sort of currency of invoicing of trade. There's a lot of active work on the dollar being absolutely the dominant currency in which trade is conducted. Financial institutions in the US are incredibly powerful. And that's a source of leverage, right? So, you know, the Chileans might not like if they are asked not to trade with China, and they might be inclined to not go through, but if they're controlled through the financial aspects of it, that's a lot of leverage. That's going to matter. So I do think that I do think that we should have a bigger integration between, and Hélène and I have sort of over the years shared this view, and she's an international finance macroeconomist who's done a lot of work in trade, and I've taught myself on some of these financial aspects, but yeah, but I don't know about the stock market, and I mean, at some point, obviously, if we have these rounds of tariffs and we start to see inflationary tensions, obviously we might see some action there, but who knows what and when that's going to happen.
You want to add something?
Yeah, so no, I mean, it was a great answer. Just to add a bit on the financial side. So what is obviously very interesting in the financial side is that since you have this very centralized network with the dollar being so important, and a lot of international transaction, whether it is because of the trade invoicing, but also, and especially because issuance of dollar bonds, use of dollar asset, etc. So the dollar payment system being extremely used and very centralized, that gives a lot of power, effectively, to the issuer of international currency to put some sanctions on the financial sphere. And we did see that. We did see a number of things. We did see exclusion of a SWIFT system, which is a messaging system of banks. We did see some seizing of reserves assets with Russia. And therefore, we are also seeing, but it's really just starting, attempts by a number of players to constitute alternative payment systems. And as Paul was saying, in the invoicing side, you can see a little bit more of RMB invoicing as opposed to dollar invoicing, in particular for countries which are in the bloc linked to Russia, right? I mean, it's all very logical. However, I would still want to emphasize that it's really very small compared to still the use of a dollar internationally. So the RMB, yes, is making a little bit of a change in terms of invoicing and swap lines and stuff like that, but it's still very tiny.
So, I mean, if I understand your question, but it maps to what I said very quickly at the end, but even though we are definitely seeing significant action in certain types of trade flows, I mentioned that US imports from China are 20% down in 2023. Hélène showed us this very nice figure indicating differential trade growth within and across blocks. There's certainly some action going on, but we're not seeing an aggregate decline in aggregate measures of globalization, in the sense that the U.S., when you look at what it consumes, there's part of it that is coming from domestic production, part of it that is imported. It used to be imported, a lot of it from China. Now it's being imported from third countries like Mexico or Vietnam. But we see that those are precisely the set of countries where China is exporting more to. Now, that is because all these movements have moved from sort of China to Vietnam, China to Mexico. The moment that the Trump administration, if and when they sort of start putting tariffs not only on China, but maybe putting tariffs on Vietnam or tariffs on Mexico, this is where this process of reorganization might actually end up affecting measures of globalization, because some of that activity might actually be moving within the border of the U.S. At which point, when you look at what the U.S. is consuming, a higher share of their consumption might be coming from domestic goods, less from imports, and that will put downward pressure on the series that I was showing you. So, yeah, no, it hasn't happened. If we go on this trend, and especially the U.S. starts putting tariffs on just about anybody that shows up at the border, obviously at some point that's going to have to lead, and other countries retaliate, that's going to have to lead to a decline in sort of standard measures of globalization. Okay, yes, that's the trouble when you write about it. Now then you have to, I mean, I think long story short is I don't know how much we know about the impact, so I'm certainly not ready to speak on the impact on the labor market, which is obviously lots of people are debating about. We know that it's a technology that is here. It's being used very significantly. The aspects, I touch upon this in two ways. One, in sort of a section where I talk a little bit about the data economy and big data, and big data is both an input in production, but also a traded good, and that sort of raises interesting issues for globalization. And then sort of I touch on an aspect that is, I'm not quite sure why I wrote about it. It was fun, but it's a little bit more out of the box, which is this idea that AI might really transform policy making. For instance, there's a lot of push for industrial policy in many countries in the world. And if you read some folks, they seem to have the view of, yes, that not always worked very well, but because we tried the subsidies and we targeted sectors and those sectors didn't pan out the way we thought they were going to pan out. And maybe if we had the information we now have, if we could roll out subsidies and track performance in real time, we might have the tools to implement policies that are more surgical, that are really trying to kind of make sure that we're not using subsidies the wrong way. And it's sort of appealing to think about it that way, but then when you try pushing this, you get to people like Jack Ma and Alibaba that's claiming, you know, for the same reason, why stop at industrial subsidies, industrial policy? Maybe, you know, maybe central planning is going to have a comeback. You know, there's a lot of, now that seems like far-fetched, but there's a lot of folks in the United States in the 1940s, think about the Coles Foundation, Lange, Marshak. There's a bunch of very good economists, even Koopmans, that were thinking hard about market socialism and how the government could play the role of allocating resources to the best possible uses. And then the Chicago School or Hayek proposed the criticism of what does the price mechanism do? And what I argue in the paper is that if you go back to Hayek and you understand the criticism of Hayek's criticism is not, don't do central planning because we don't have big data, we don't have the computers to kind of compute the right allocations. This is not about computing power. It's not about artificial intelligence. It's really about what the price mechanism does as sort of a revealer of information. And AI is not a substitute for that. So it's sort of a cautionary tale of just be careful about invoking AI as a solution for problems for which it really is not.
Okay, well, we are coming to the end of this lecture, but let me take the privilege of the chair to ask a final question. International trade is mainly or mostly about goods, commodities, manufacturing. But what about services? Because some services are tradable. So is trading services part of the hidden treasures to be uncovered?
Definitely, but they're very well hidden. So I touch upon this a bit in the paper. There's good reasons why services are harder to measure. There's no tangible transaction that you can record. Lots of the services are, in the same case as trading goods, are transacted within firm boundaries. A beauty of intra-firm transactions of merchandise is that even though it might be Ford sending an engine to another factory, it's crossing a border, it's recorded. But when the R&D team in the US places a phone call to the plant in Valencia and helps them out with a process where the machine's stuck or something, that's an export of a service that is never going to show up in statistics. So by their nature, they're very hard to measure. But having said that, I think we do a particularly poor job of recording them. The sort of sources we have for this are very different, the type of customs forms that we require firms to fill up in international transactions. And in the digital age, I don't see a reason for that. I mean, we could sort of have much more detailed surveys that we ask companies to report, and more disaggregated data could be very helpful. Even when we don't have the universe of those exports, would be useful to understand how, subtle differences in the type of services that are transacted might affect different types of occupations. The type of aggregated data we have now, that's not very useful. So there's good reasons why it's been limited, and there's some great work on trade and services, but there's good reasons why there isn't more progress, because it has to do with data quality, but we could do more. I think we should do more on that front.
Okay, with this hopeful statement on the future of international trade, let's close the session. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Hélène. You know, as Hélène said, you can read the paper, you should read the paper in a forthcoming issue of the Journal of the European Economic Association. Thank you to the Fundación BBVA for hosting this meeting, and thanks to you for being here tonight. Thank you.